Sawadee Carp, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, we are going to be talking about fundamentals of safer use of non-steroidal SARMs. This is going to be a series of videos that I make. We're going to dive into pretty good detail about different classes of compounds, dosages, how to use them, cycle timing, post-cycle therapy recommendations, blood work, safety profiles. I'm going to try and present a whole bunch of information here, but I am mindful of the people that have relatively limited capacity to kind of sit down and absorb information. So I'm going to try and break these videos down into smaller chunks. So what would I like to cover in today's video? I would just like to explain to people that are unfamiliar with this argument why this subject is so controversial, why it's so polarizing in our tribe. All right, and hopefully, from this starting point, it makes it easier to do your due diligence on this class of compound and to understand whether or not this is something that's right for you, which is the right choice for you. And hopefully by the time we get to the end of this video, you will have a new point of view on why SARMs are so polarizing, all right, why they're so controversial in our tribe. So let me basically just explain this, because this is not well understood. It might seem really obvious when I've explained it to you, but it is not well understood in both user communities. So firstly, understand that really ever since testosterone was first identified in the 1940s as having medical clinical application, right? There has been attempts by let's just call it the pharmaceutical industry, to modify the testosterone molecule in such a way that it either maintained or held on to its anabolic potential, or even increased it, ideally, at the same time as minimizing or playing down its androgenic potential, which is really where most of the side effects, most of the consequence of use comes from. Okay, only a fool would try to argue that the use of testosterone, androgen replacement therapy at higher doses doesn't come with consequence of use. It simply does. Okay. One could very easily argue that at replacement doses, in other words, if you are simply restoring a man's testosterone levels to natural range, that comes with no risk. You had that range your whole life from being a teenager, all through your 20s, all through your 30s. Why can I not use a replacement therapy practice that restores that function to those previously held levels without significant risk? And that's a very fair argument. That's the concept of replacement therapy versus performance enhancement outcomes, which is the world that I live in. I'm interested in more than simply replenishment. I'm interested in what I refer to as supraphysiological outcomes, performance enhancing outcomes here. Okay. So it's important to understand that really, as I said, ever since testosterone was recognized as having a clinical medical application, that the research community has been attempting to do exactly that, develop SARMs, compounds that are tissue selective, that work on the bone and skeletal muscle tissue, but affect our secondary sexual characteristics in the case of women, and affect our sex organs like our prostate in the case of men to a lesser degree than testosterone. That is the definition of a SARMs: tissue selectivity, androgen receptor tissue selectivity. Okay, so anyone that's using these drugs today, like I do, Anavar, Primobolan, Masteron, Nandrolone, we can keep rattling them out, is already using SARMs, all right? That's what they are, okay? That was the whole point. They weren't developed for bodybuilders. They were developed for clinical application with the understanding or the intent of minimizing the androgenic impact on patients, okay? So the research community have been attempting to do this since the 50s, and they did this to a relatively profound extent. Some of the drugs that we have are very, very tissue selective. The challenge has they never managed to totally remove the androgenic impact that's always been in the background. All right. And when you elevate doses to super physiological doses, that level of androgen activity that's still there can be problematic. Okay. So the promise of SARMs, all right, and when I say that I mean non-steroidal SARMs, next generation SARMs, if you want to call them then, is to pick up where that research effort left off and continue down that path. So nothing new about the goal here, guys. Been around a long time. The early work was based around the modification of the testosterone molecule. The current generation is based around different chemical structures, so they're no longer modifying testosterone. They are modifying completely different chemical frameworks or chemical structures to that end. Okay, so this is the point that many people in our tribe just don't understand. Whenever they did that to a testosterone molecule, obviously what they did was then they went and compared what the consequence of that modification was in real-world application as a comparator against testosterone. Hopefully you follow what that means. They modified the testosterone molecule, they tested it, and they came back and they said, compared to testosterone, this drug has enhanced anabolic potential and minimized androgenic potential of X value. Therefore, we can deploy it potentially in this clinical setting to this end, right? And that was a very logical, fucking rational thing to do because that's what they were trying to do. Now, what do you think they should do if they're going to introduce a new class of compounds to do that? They should be comparing it to testosterone, all right? That's what they need to do, right? And this is what the pro-SARMs user community just don't get their fucking head around. That's the whole point, all right? How do these drugs stack up against the comparator drug? How do these drugs stack up against the first generation of SARMs in terms of efficacy, all right, and in terms of safety profile? If they stack up well, they should be deployed. And if they don't stack up well, what's the fucking point, right? So in other words, if we have a second or third generation of drugs coming through that are more efficacious and have a better safety profile, we should use them, right? But if we have drugs that come along that don't work as well, right, or have similar classes of problems attached to their use, you can understand why the historical user community would go, well, why would we use that? That doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, and that's the big rift between the two communities, and that is those in the SARMs community, just for some fucking reason that I do not understand, don't want to compare their drugs against steroids. And they have to be. That's the whole point. They're being developed as next generation solutions to the problems that exist with steroids. Right? So they need to be stacked up against steroids. You need to be able to hold these drugs up against the previous generation of solutions and say, how do they compare? And when you do that, the conversation changes. And why does the conversation change? Because what you find is you have a whole tribe of people using these drugs that say, hey, listen, as long as you're moderate with use, and as long as you are, and careful with their application, right, drugs like Anavar can serve us very well. They're fabulous at growth promotion, and they come with very moderate risk attached. They do have risk attached. There is consequence of use. You see things like HDL suppression, absolutely, which is bad for your heart, yes. You have androgen receptors on the heart, potentially that can cause things like left ventricular hypertrophy, yes, all right. But they do a very good job at what we're trying to get them to do, which is promote anabolism with minimal risk, okay? So along comes a second class of drugs designed to do the same thing therapeutically, right? It just makes sense that we hold them up and say, how do these drugs compare? And the reality is, today, not based on totality of SARMs, because this is an extension of the SARMs discussion, they're not as anabolic, right? And they have a large number of questions over health and safety applications applied to them that we still haven't answered yet. And so here's the question, and then here's hopefully what people can then go, okay, I get what you're saying is the non-steroidal SARMs are an extension of the research work that went into steroidal SARMs, pursuing the same ends, all right? Today, if we're going to use them, we're going to stack them up, we're going to compare them against, well, if I compare it against Trenbolone, how does it stack up in terms of the bang for its buck versus the risk profile it presents? Trenbolone is a SARMs, all right? And this is where the two tribes tend to part, because those that are in the guys that have crossed to the dark side already, generally, when you speak to most guys, and I put myself in this camp, once you've used testosterone, nandrolone, Trenbolone, Anavar, Primabol, and Masteron, and then you go back and you try SARMs, you kind of go, dude, this is like riding a push bike with kiddie wheels after you've ridden a Ducati, right? It's not that they don't work, okay? It's not that they don't have merit, and if we never used those class of drugs, if we never had access to those classes of drugs, if we never abused them for performance enhancement, we might be enamored with SARMs as well, right? But the reality is, once you've crossed that threshold, and once you go back, you tend to go like, "Fuck, is that it? That's okay. I can see what you're saying, but that's it, right?" And this is the problem. It's like saying, "Okay, is there a place for these things?" Yes. But when you do what you should do, which is stack them up against testosterone as the comparator, they're very weak, okay? They have the promise of a better safety profile, agreed, but that hasn't been demonstrated yet, okay? You take a drug like RAD140, which is, in my opinion, one of the SARMs class of drugs that has, at the moment, based on what we have available to us at the moment, one of the best efficacy profiles that exists, all right? There isn't a single human study, not one, all right? We have a primate study and we have a mouse study, or a rat study, rodent study, correct. That doesn't represent to me what I would call high safety profile, okay? It represents to me an emerging drug that, we need to look at, and we need to understand better. And if you want to be an early adopter and you want to take on that risk profile of not really understanding what that class of drug will do because we don't have the data, by all means. I don't have a problem in the world with that, right? I know lots and lots of people who have tried RAD40 who have basically gone back to steroids, and I have no problem with that, but you need to understand that a drug that has no human studies, you cannot logically and rationally, just because it has the promise, right, of a lower impact on male secondary sexual characteristics and impact on, say, the prostate, that's never been tested in humans, you can't say that has a better safety profile. It has a higher risk profile because it's untested, right? And so as we go through this videos, I'm hoping to present this information in a logical, rational, not I sell fucking SARMs that I make money out of it basis, all right? So takeaways from today's video. Let's close it down at this point. 2 takeaways. 1, you need to understand that these classes of drugs, non-steroidal SARMs, are being developed, right, in an effort to basically pick up where steroidal SARMs failed. And that is the removal, right, of adverse events against deployment on secondary sexual male characteristics, including, basically the prostate in men and virilization effects in women, okay? That's what they're being developed for, okay? The extension of that discussion. And so the only fair point from that forward is that we compare them against the comparator testosterone and potentially against the other anabolic steroids at clinical doses and at performance enhancing doses. When we compare the profile, they must be compared to each other. They have to be. One is designed to displace the other in clinical practice. Therefore, it must be compared. And guys just don't want to do that. And when you do that, what you'll find is that they are not as efficacious and they have the potential. Absolutely, I agree with you. Just like Anavar has the potential to be better for you, or Primabol better for you, and it is, in my opinion, than high-dose testosterone. I would much rather see a guy on high-dose primobolan than testosterone. And I'll argue that all day with someone. Why? Because it's going to have less impact on your sexual organs like your prostate, less androgenic impact. I support that mode 100%, but people will often push back on primobolan and say the same thing. It's not strong enough. You'll hear this time and time and time again. Yes, there's a balancing act. Primobolan is a drug that produces good outcomes with a good safety profile, but it's not as strong as some. And so there is a compromise. And so that compromise basically is one that I support. Now, when you move to the next generation, you go, okay, so how does something like X stack up? Well, you go, we don't have any human clinical data. We can't really comment. We just have, anecdote and as evidence, observation as evidence. And most people that you speak to will acknowledge the fact that these class of drugs don't stack up well against their predecessors in terms of performance outcomes. They hope that they have a better safety profile. They may well have a better safety profile, okay? But right now we can't say that with a high degree of confidence because we don't have the data to support it, okay? And so you find yourself now sitting there going, okay, now I need to rethink this discussion. I'm going to basically choose this class of SARMs or that class of SARMs. I recognize what both classes of drugs were trying to do, minimize the impact of androgens on deployment, either clinically or as we use them in performance enhancement. And I need to balance against that how well they work. Okay, so it is literally a risk-reward discussion. I want this return, and I'm prepared to adopt this risk. In the world of the anabolic and androgenic steroid, the risks are very well understood. They're very well known. These are drugs that have been deployed since the 1950s. We have hundreds of human clinical studies on them. But interesting, and here's the thing that I point out to guys all the time. There are anomalies. Why does the drug boldenone that looks fabulous on paper have such a big impact on our kidneys? Nobody can tell me why. Not from the chemical structure. It doesn't make sense, but it does. Okay? Why does this drug do that, and why does that drug do this? You have to understand all of these SARMs that are coming forward. We need the answers to these questions before we can answer them. So, in the next video I'm going to explain, if you want to use SARMs, what SARMs should you use? What should you expect? How should you approach it? And where's the threshold that you would get to that you might say, okay, so it's been a good ride. I feel like I've gotten decent return from that, and it's now time to either stay in my lane or step up to the next generation or the other class of SARMs, which absolutely has the potential to come with both accelerated reward and possibly accelerated risk. We don't know, as I said. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you will tune in for the coming series of SARMs Fundamentals of Safer Use videos from the Victor Black Masterclass. Sawadee ka.